Mark Mitchell, welcome to the show.
Yeah, really happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on today. I really do appreciate it. You, of course, are with Rasmussen, and you folks really expertly called and predicted the election for months before it happened. And this really contrasted with a lot of other pollsters who really got it wrong, said Kamala Harris had a healthy lead. And it was kind of a repeat of 2016 in a lot of ways when they said Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. So, really general question to start off with. How were you folks so right and why was everybody else so wrong?
Uh, at the end of the day, we don't have a vested interest in making sure that Trump loses, I think is ultimately what it comes down to. I know that's a simplistic take, but when, I mean, real, 538 went and looked at every single state call, the average of the polling over the last 3 cycles, every single one with Trump on the ballot. And in only one case did the state polling show that Donald Trump was actually winning. And yet he won most of those, right? Because he's been the president twice now. So it really is fascinating. They're just liars. They shill for Democrats. And I think we prove them wrong. I do think there are some things that we do differently than others that help us be a little bit more accurate. We're a lot less aggressive in shifting our methodology to more newfangled stuff. And we also poll continuously. So we're still in the field now, whereas most of these people are going to disappear till the next election. And then they pop their heads up above the ground and look around and try and be accurate. And when you're in a newsroom, when you report up to a managing editor, when you have Democrats blasting you all the time, all these people have an interest in the Democrats winning, it does color the numbers you put out, as we've seen time and time again.
So is there any point, do you think, that they're going to just lose credibility? Because again, if they're just wrong cycle after cycle, then you'd think that people would just stop listening to them eventually.
I think they did lose credibility. I think they've been losing credibility for years. I think people have become more and more untrusting of the media. We got to the point in the last 4 years where now 60% of voters think the media is the enemy of the people. But what's crazy is it didn't happen until just like last week, where it finally came into crashing realization that they've destroyed themselves. MSNBC hosts ratings are down across the board. It's ridiculous. And on election night, nobody was paying attention to the mainstream media. They were watching live independent feeds. That's totally different than 2020. And I'll tell you, the polling industry is already a laughing stock. I mean, you have me, Rich Barris, Atlas Intel out there dunking mercilessly on Nate Silver and 538 and on the AAPOR for just being wrong. They built an industry like academic sages and ivory towers that are out of touch and driven by Democrat interests. And that's why the independent pollsters are just like running rings around these people. That's really what it comes down to. And I'm not saying, hey, we're the most accurate, follow us. I think we were most accurate this time, but there's a ton of different yardsticks that one could choose. What I'm saying is just don't listen to the mainstream media pollsters. Just listen to independent pollsters and you're not going to be lied to.
So is there something specific that they're doing wrong? I mean, they can't just be skewing the data completely, right? Like, is it some kind of bad practice?
Well, it comes down to, I mean, this is a very complex question. There are many ways, and some of it's intentional and some of it's not. First off, they got huge teams and lots of budget, and they can do things that we can't afford to do, like live operator calls. And they say, well, that's the gold standard because it costs more than robo dialing. The thing is that if you've ever taken one of those live operator calls, they're really creepy. You're prodded by the interviewer. They reword the questions, and you really have no idea what's going on in those surveys. And the research has shown that they actually insert a left-wing bias. Then you have this new practice of proprietary panels, where you have like Ipsos, who builds 50,000 person panel that supposedly represents America. The thing is that if you do it wrong, it doesn't represent America. They have exactly the kind of people you'd think building this panel, mid-20s, out of college, pronouns in the LinkedIn bio, community managers. And I can look at the data coming out of them and say it just looks different than mine. These people give the Democrat way more of a favorability advantage than Trump, even though Trump got more votes than any Republican presidential candidate in history in 2020. In Reuters Ipsos polling, Trump has a 25-point favorability disadvantage against Kamala Harris. It's that crazy. And then you just see things like, oh, abortion's their number one issue. No, it's not. Like stuff like that. And then also they play around with the weightings. They oversample Democrats. Again, some of this is intentional, some of it's not. They were showing a lead gain for Kamala Harris by increasing Democrat weighting. Like that's disingenuous.
Mm.
And then you have the New York Times who put out state polls and included in the crosstabs the 2020 recalled vote. And it showed that in some of the state polls where Trump was doing well, they actually nailed Arizona. They had Arizona like plus 4 or 5, really Trumpy result for them. And you looked at the 2020 recall vote and you could say to yourself, wow, they actually got a good mix. Arizona was tied in 2020 and they showed that the balance was tied in the recall vote. But then they put out Harris plus 3 in Pennsylvania and they oversampled Biden 2020 voters by 7 points. So that also showed, in my opinion, that Trump was winning Pennsylvania when their poll comes out and says that. But the top line that the media runs with is that Harris is up 3 in Pennsylvania. So there's all kinds of tricks. The media is doing it, cherry picking to put the narratives out. The pollsters are doing it intentionally, unintentionally, even confirmation bias. I get a result back. I want Harris to win. And I say to myself, oh, it shows Trump doing too well. So maybe something's wrong. And I go collect more data or I change the weightings around. It's just a total mess. But ultimately, what it comes down to is that for some reason, just the independent pollsters have the integrity to put out the truth. And so it's ultimately an integrity issue.
It's just a weird thing too when you kind of think about it, because I understand that there may be a motivation to make Harris look good going into the election, but ultimately it just kind of shoots themselves in the foot because it discredits them and it also leads to this huge surprise when she loses. So it's weird to me. It seems very short-sighted. You think that they would just, kind of report what the truth is so that everybody's kind of prepared for it.
Yeah, I think it's like a crack addict. I don't think that they ever say to themselves, wow, reality is going to come crashing down until they actually hit rock bottom.
Hmm.
Because credibility is destroyed a little bit at a time, right? And then all of a sudden it happens really fast. I'm telling you, like MSNBC hosts, 50, 60% ratings crash in just a week or two. A lot of those people will come back. But I mean, they were told that Trump is Hitler. And now they're going to watch a peaceful transfer of power to Hitler.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I saw that I thought was a little interesting was CNN, where they were seemingly acknowledging that there was a disparity between the polling and previous election results. And the way that they framed it is, we underestimated Trump in both 2016 and 2020, but we underestimated Democrats in the 2022 midterm election. So they were kind of putting out there, based on those different polling errors, this could be anything, I guess, from a Trump landslide to a Harris landslide.
So let's kind of talk about what happens if you have an average error and apply it to the electoral map, right? Well, if we have an average error and Donald Trump benefits from the average error, guess what? He gets way past 270 electoral votes. He gets to 312. Why? He carries all the Great Lake battleground states. He carries the Southeast battleground states of North Carolina and Georgia. And he carries Nevada and Arizona out west. But of course, Jessica, there's no guarantee that the polls being offered necessarily benefit Donald Trump, even though they did both in 2016 and 2020, because they could, in fact, the polling miss could benefit Kamala Harris like it did the Democrats back in 2022. If there was, in fact, a polling miss that benefited Kamala Harris, an average polling miss, she'd get north of 300 electoral votes. Look at that. She'd get to 319. Why? She'd carry the Great Lake battleground states, right? She'd carry Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. She'd carry the Southeast battleground states, Georgia, North Carolina. And she'd carry the Southwest battleground states of Nevada and Arizona. So the bottom line is this. The polls at this point point to a race that's way too close to call, but an average miss in either direction could turn this into an electoral college blowout. We just don't know at this point.
For me, that was a little dumb because, if Trump is the one who's consistently in those elections, then obviously there's an issue with Trump specifically. But I guess I was just curious too, was there any issue with the 2022 election? And why was there seemingly, why did the corporate media seemingly think that Democrats were going to do worse than they did?
I think that the corporate media wants to be able to convince their viewers that sometimes the polls understate Democrat support. saw that argument a lot because at certain points in the race, the polls were really bad for Kamala Harris. Now, there was a period of time in September, October where they were all trying to make it look like she was winning. But what's
I
crazy
think
is
she had
they
like a
couldn't make,
6 point lead at one point.
yeah, depending on the poll, the Real Clear Politics aggregate, you can literally look at it. It was locked in at Harris plus 2.2 for September and half of October. And what was crazy is they just couldn't keep their foot on the gas pedal. And whether that's they were trying to save their credibility, I don't know. But our numbers never really changed. So the race was already locked in. So we proved them lying there. But what they were trying to do is offer cope that, oh, no, that she could be under emphasized in the polling. And this narrative was so strong because that's why everybody glommed onto that ridiculous Ann Seltzer poll that was thrown out at the last minute. That was Harris +3 in Iowa. Absolutely no way. But they refer to 2022 and they refer to Romney in 2012. And I can tell you first, any comparisons to elections where Trump is not on the ballot, I don't think are valid because the enthusiasm level for Trump and Romney are two totally different things, especially considering that 15 million of Trump's votes comes from not Republicans, right? So that's one. And yeah, okay, 2022. In my opinion, the real issue is this. So we put out polls, and first, it's really tough to predict midterm turnout. And everybody talks about 2022 and how big of a turnout 2020 was. They don't talk about 2018. In 2018, the midterm turnout increased over 60%. It was like nothing anybody had ever seen. And there was no COVID, and a lot of people would just explain it away as, oh, well, everybody thought Trump was a Russian asset. I think there's a lot more to it than that. And I think that that's the very first question to answer when everybody's asking, as I think we're going to talk about, like, where did these votes go? So our polling in 2022 started off a year out with a generic ballot at really massive levels, like 10% for Republicans. And around that time, other polls were coming out with the same kind of thing. And it looks like, Newt Gingrich was saying, oh, it's a red wave. We're going to see a 60-seat pickup. Okay. And I would say that over the cycle, the polls narrowed a bit. We were seeing more of like Republican +7 or 8. Some of that, I think, is a Democrat response bias in that they got their candidate in the office. They don't feel the need to answer polls anymore. And some of it was people were really, really, really pissed off at what was happening in the fall of 2021. They were really pissed off. So, fast forward to the middle of 2022 in the summer, the Dobbs decision came out, and that also pissed off people. And Democrats started answering polls, and the polls tightened to in the vicinity of 4 or 5 points in the generic ballot, which is huge because that's kind of like the national popular vote. It's easier for Republicans to win that in a midterm because the Democrats don't have their massive presidential turnout machine kicked in, right? And coming into the fall, the numbers were oscillating between +1 and +7. It's kind of hard to say what the answer is going to be, but the average of our polling was Republicans +4. I think it came out at 2.8. So Republicans won the election. They had a big advantage across the country. And what you saw was not that much of a pickup. Okay. And so everybody says, oh, the Democrats were under F. Well, were they? No, the Republicans were the favorite there. And they went from a +10 a year out to a +4. It's still a bigger win, technically, than what we're seeing now. But the thing is that just like this election, the entire country moved 7 points to the right from 2020. Should have been massive down ballot pickups. And you could say, all right, well, they picked up some of that in 2020 or 2022. Okay, but like when the country moves 7 points to the right, that's 30 seats pickup if you're just looking proportionally at the House. And yet barely anything was picked up in the last 4 years. And so the big question I have is how come the Democrats are really good at turning out exactly what they need to, exactly when they need to, and where they need to? Why is there such an asymmetrical disadvantage for Republicans when it comes to districting? Where's all this money coming from? Why do the Republicans always seem like they're just in an utter electioneering disadvantage? And I think a lot of that is they don't like the direction of where their own party is going. And as we're seeing play out right now. And so that's the big question. Republican voters want MAGA, period. The Republican Party, in my opinion, does not and has not been pulling their weight over the last 8 years, and hopefully that's going to change soon.
Hmm. Well, going back to the 2024 election results and really that enthusiasm behind Trump, was there any one specific issue that you think really propelled the Trump campaign, or was it just an amalgam of different issues?
Um, so in my polling, I saw almost zero movement, to be honest with you. Back in 2016, when the candidates were less known, there was less of an existential crisis for people. There were periods where Trump was up big. There were periods where Clinton was up big in our polls, went back and forth. Here, Trump was beating Biden by about 4 or 5 points coming into the summer, and it narrowed to about 2 or 3 points. And that's it. It didn't matter if Trump got shot, didn't matter if there were debate. It just didn't matter. And so I don't think issues in the parlance of news media, i.e., what's driving the narratives, mattered at all. The issues I think that mattered are if you give people a list, they'll say economy number one, border number two, and abortion number three. Now, we also asked it a different way where we put threat to democracy on the ballot. And so if you're a Republican, the issues, or an independent, the issues are the economy and the border. And if you're a Democrat, the issues are threat to democracy and abortion. And so are they really saying that abortion is why they're voting? No, they're a threat to democracy because they hate Trump. And so the left was voting because they hate Trump, and the right was voting because things suck. They say border and economy, but I have a million questions that show that it's more visceral and real than that. And like I'll just rattle off some numbers from our September state polling where we did 10 states and combined all the results. It was like only 37% of battleground voters said they're better off than they were 4 years ago. Only 27% said that they were safer than they were 4 years ago. Only 22% said that today's children will be better off than their parents. That's like really horrifying. And then there's all these other clues where it's like they can't afford groceries. So you say the economy, oh, inflation is the number one issue. It's like, no, there's an existential crisis for the middle class. And then the border is a massive crisis too. And in my opinion, there's a big overlap between the economy and the border. And that's why everybody is so viscerally against illegal immigration. Back in 2016, the racist attacks on Donald Trump did kind of have some impact. But now we asked if you had the choice between 100% deportation candidate or 100% amnesty candidate, who would you choose? And the battleground voters go deportation like 53-36. It's ridiculous. They want them all gone. The Hispanic voters want the border militarized. So that's where we're at. Oh, it's the border. No, it's not the border. It's like, no, they didn't rate her kind of mediocre as the borders are, and they think somebody else is going to have better policies. It's like, no, they want a catapult. They want a moat and laser beams. And the Democrats, what's crazy is how far they've gotten with all of these luxury anti-American beliefs. That's what's crazy. And even how close the election was, considering how unpopular these beliefs are. Democrats don't like legal immigration, but they just hate Trump more, and they want to see him lose. So peak gaslighting. It has not been good for the sanity of voters in America. Hopefully there will be a little bit of a reassessment, but I don't know. I don't think the centralized Democrat talking points have started dropping in mainstream news media outlets yet. I'm pretty sure they're probably poll testing which direction to run right now. So I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, whether that's Elon Musk is working for Russia and Starlink hacked the vote. Been seeing a lot of that on X lately.
Yeah, exactly. I heard it was because he's doing it just because he's a leech off the government and he really wants that GS-15 salary that's 160,000 a year. That's why he spent 140 million. Yeah.
Yeah, well, just go back to the issues, the economy thing, that's what I really found most absurd because, obviously if you talk to pretty much any middle class, working class person, they're going to tell you the economy's bad right now. They can't afford groceries because inflation went up 20% over the last several years. Household credit card debt has skyrocketed. But it seemed as though the Democrats were really tone deaf to that and just saying, oh, but inflation has slowed down now, even though it went up significantly. And the unemployment rate is low. Even though, anecdotally, it's pretty hard to find a job right now. There's a lot of people who are just looking for jobs for months or a year or more. So it just seemed as though there was a real disconnect where people were telling the Democrats the economy is bad, but the Democrats kept telling the people, no, it's not.
Yeah, I don't think they fundamentally want to or can understand what they did to their own credibility. And this is beyond just the media. And a really good example is if you compare candidate favorability. So Kamala Harris has had pretty low favorability ratings, 43, 44%, a point or two less than Biden's, depending on when we asked. And when she became candidate, they did shoot up a little bit, got up to 47, 48, and Trump was at 48, 49, depending on whether you poll nationally or in the states. But we asked, do you trust the federal government? And only 30% of people say yes. So when you're in office and you're the face of the government and you refer to government statistics or talk to voters as if they aren't smart enough to know whether they're economically in a good situation or not, like that's really, really tone deaf. I mean, this is the same government that really screwed people over during COVID. I mean, it's the same government where voters aren't stupid. They know that the Department of Justice is being politically weaponized. They say that Joe Biden's personal Gestapo is the FBI, 54%, something like that.
Well,
And so, oh no, like the employment rate's zero and the stock market's rip roaring. They know that's the billionaires that are, taking advantage of that. And our unemployment rate that we've been putting it out since April because the lies are so bad. It's not 4%. It's like 8.5.
well, they don't do those metrics the same anymore, right? Both unemployment rate and inflation. I think that the numbers as they used to report them back in like the 80s or 90s, they do the math differently now, right?
Oh yeah, strip stuff out. Oh, it's just like consumption inflation. Oh, you got to take housing out of it. Oh, I don't know what that. I don't think anybody should pay attention to them. Why would you believe the government at all about anything? That's the current environment we're in, and hopefully, I think Trump will restore that. They don't believe the government about elections even. They don't believe the government about medical information. Like literally everything has been burned. It's absolutely crazy. And yeah, they've been looking for 2 months, so they drop out of the math. Or we got to seasonally adjust it. No, that's why I think our information. Listen, if the media did their job, like we'd be out of business. And yet they have to look at my unemployment rate to know the real answer. Like who else is putting that out there? It's crazy.
Well, I'm curious since you mentioned that. So, like, can you go into what that disparity is a little bit? I know that there's these job reports that keep getting revised too, right? So they put out these jobs
Yeah.
reports and then they'll go back and say, oh, no, actually, we didn't have that. And in October, I think actually the official number was the worst jobs report since December of 2020. But even still, with those high numbers that they were putting out previously, I think Zero Hedge put out a report digging into a little bit for I think it was August, and what they found was that it was the private sector non-farm payroll actually went down, and it was reported government jobs that were really driving that job growth. But yeah, again, I just would be interested to hear what you're hearing about you're polling on the labor market because again, what we're hearing is that it's great, this is record low unemployment, but just again, anecdotally, people are looking for jobs for months. There seems to be this new thing with ghost jobs where companies are putting out positions that they're not actually actively hiring for. So it's sort of a weird labor market currently.
Yeah, Zero Hedge has been all over this. I haven't had a chance to really read them very much in the last 2 or 3 months. But yeah, I mean, the theme on Zero Hedge is don't trust any regime metrics at all. And they've talked about the systematic revision down, which in my opinion, everybody just focuses on the headline, and the headline's what moves the markets, not the revision, right? And so I think that that's probably more evidence of the government in DC trying to puff up its favorite regime candidate. That's the real issue. It's not Republican or Democrat. It's status quo in DC versus the voters who don't get what they want. And I don't know all the ins and outs of, I'm sure like ADP reports the non-farm payrolls. I'm sure that's one of the inputs. But ours is really simple. We poll every night, and one of the questions we ask is, what's your job? What's your employment situation? And one of the results is unemployed but looking for work. And we've reported that number every month now. It's about 10,000 people a month. I've heard that the Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys 50 or 60,000 people, which is a massive waste of money. And yet also that they haven't been able to fill the survey numbers, and I mean, there's just like a lot of question marks around what they do. But our number, depending on the month, it was 8.1% back in April. It got up as high as 8.7%. I think it's 8.5% now. Point is, it's 8%. It's not 4%. It's twice as big. And we're not, I mean, it's literally just the question. Like, you can see the crosstabs, you can tell by age. Yep, younger Americans are less employed. 15% of them don't have jobs but are looking
Wow.
for jobs. That's really
nuts.
bad. Right. And it's not like, oh, you got part-time. Like, this is people that say, no, I'm looking for work, I don't have a job. And then there's another 10% who aren't in the workforce. So again, it's probably apples to oranges, but it's incontrovertibly a much worse number than them. There's no way to reconcile our number to their number.
Yeah, and again, I mean, it was the same thing with inflation, right? Like, if you actually tracked the price of goods at a grocery store, just a shopping cart full of goods, the prices were way higher than what the government was saying back in 2022. But yeah, let's. I also wanted to ask about the demographic growth that Trump saw, because one thing that we've seen in the exit polling is that Trump really grew his support among basically every demographic. I think the only exceptions were older folks, senior citizens, college educated whites, and those making over $100,000 a year. But seemingly every other demographic, African Americans, Latinos, young people, it seems as though his support grew. So just kind of curious what your general thoughts on that are. Why did that happen? Was the economy a major factor there? And just what did you kind of notice looking at the demographics?
So we haven't gone back and done a top up of our demographics to see what weighting changes we need to. Here's the problem, is that everybody says, oh, the pollsters were lying. Oh, you can't believe the mainstream media polls. Then the election's over, and within a week, they're like, oh, look at the exit polls. Well, who makes those? It's like CNN and NBC, right? So we're going to wait until there's some more real voter validated studies that come out about who voted in the election. But I can tell you, just internally, the demographic numbers have been absolute crushing defeat for Democrats in every one of their core, interest groups, except upper class white voters. I think that that's going to be the biggest shift left, but there's massive shift lefts in Hispanic support. And in our polling, we showed that more in 2020 than now. I mean, there was an increase since then, but just not as much as between 2016 and 2020. And then the Black support went from mid-teens last cycle to, we had polls where it was as high as 30%. You're never going to see
Black
that.
males specifically, right? At least based on the
No,
exit
for
polling
us, it was black. It was all Black voters for us. Now, other people in their polls see different things. Like, I'll show, for instance, less white support for Trump than other people, but more Black support or Hispanic support. So there's some ups and downs that you just can't get rid of when people have entirely different methodologies. Like, for instance, Reuters Ipsos, it entirely depends on what Black voters they choose to put in their 50,000 person panel, right? And also, again, the methodology in some of these exit pollings is also very questionable, because a lot of them are on-site surveys of voters who I really question, just like with live operators, are they getting the right answer? Because there's still areas where it's not socially acceptable to support Donald Trump. So directionally, I think there's been a massive pickup. I think what we would really see in some of these studies maybe is mid-20s in the entire Black vote. And yes, driven by Black men, absolutely 100%, but also by Black women, just to a lesser extent. And time and time again, the people that support Harris are just, it's like incomes over 200,000, suburban, cat owners, believe it or not, atheists. It's like, these are all the areas where she's had pickups.
Well, and I think what this really speaks to is, a real stratification that we're seeing in terms of the parties, right? Because it seems as though the Democrat Party has shifted from, it used to sort of be the party of the working class, and it's becoming, more elitist, more academic, and these hired wage earners, these people who, again, they're older, they're just more privileged lifestyles, and what we're seeing is a lot of working class people turn to the Republicans, and even across demographics that they may not have won before. That seems to be at least the story I'm seeing. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Yeah, I think like trying to think of an analogy of exactly what happened here. Imagine it's like the American voters are a sedentary person on a couch watching TV, just enjoying life, and the Republican platform is like, well, you got to get up and exercise. And the Democrat platform is, oh man, there's a really cool show coming on. You know what I mean? It's like, we're going to entertain you, and it's all going to be about vibes and feeling. And at some point, you get flies and your couch breaks. I think that's where we're at. You know what I mean? It's like, they've literally like they've lost their ability to craft reality for people, because that's exactly what they've been trying to do. And here's a perfect example. Kamala Harris was losing with independents. If she had won with independents, she would have won the election. Independents, like we've said, are very clearly hurting in a way that, yes, even Democrats are aware of. They know this. It's just, well, what's their message and how do you address those people? She goes on Fox News, probably one of her best opportunities to address independents, since quite frankly, she probably couldn't have gone on Rogan, right? Or at least to flip voters, at least to speak to them. And what did she do? Instead, she got in an arm wrestling contest with Brett Baer over the definition of the questions. Like, how could you go on Fox News fully expecting to know you were going to be asked about the border, and instead you're fighting with him to define reality, a reality in which you didn't have any fault? Like, it's like she literally couldn't. Well, what about, yes, sorry, we couldn't address the border and here's why, but here's a realistic reason why we expect to. Like, that's what she should have said. And instead it's like, well, it's the Republicans' fault because they didn't pass the bill. It's like, not a good enough answer. You're not changing anybody's mind. And even in the debates, it was the same kind of thing. She did well in the debates. It was red meat for her supporters, but the words she was using were not at all keyed to independence. And you could actually see in those studies where they put all these people down in front of those dials and they turn the dial if they're feeling positive or negative vibes, that the independents were turning their dials in lockstep with Republicans as they watched her speak. And even before she opened her mouth, quite frankly, but nothing that she said was appealing to them. And that's because it was just all of the same ideological crap that they've been shoveling at people. But the shovel broke. That's the problem.
Well, I mean, I'd argue too, like nothing she said was even that memorable, right? Because everybody said that she won the debate, but like what do people remember from that debate? It's the eating the cats and dogs thing, right? So even though, that may have been a bad look for Trump, people were talking about Trump coming out of the debate. There was no memorable moment for Kamala Harris.
It was the feeling. Oh, look, she's sticking it to Trump. It wasn't content. It was literally, if you're in a psychological bubble of yours and your own news consumption's making, you're not. That's the crazy problem, and which I want to figure out how to see addressed is that, and this is the reason why people are fleeing Twitter very, very fast. The biggest thing that we've lost in Western, this whole idea of like the Greek logos, the idea that it's like, oh, hey, through good faith dialogue, you can learn from somebody and have a discussion and arrive at an answer. That's gone and lost. And probably it takes Jordan Peterson to understand exactly how and why and how we can get it back. But that's the problem. It's reality at some point gets so bad that you can't run away from reality. And that's what they're trying to do. Every argument for pro Harris I see on Twitter is getting mercilessly attacked and undermined because it's built on some type of lies. And that's that would have been met with censorship 4 years ago. They can't do it anymore. And so that's why I think all of this shifted in such a crazy manner. But it's like, oh, you talk about the border, about 65% of voters agree that it's an invasion. That's the right word to use. And they would say, oh, like that's Trump's platform and we got to fight it because XYZ. It's like, no, objectively a border invasion is bad. And yet an entire cadre, most of the mainstream news media will not make that stance because it hurts the Democrat platform. It is objectively bad that 2 million people a year are breaking our laws, entering the country. Most of them are criminals. They're being given taxpayer. That's all bad. It's just bad. And so if you can't agree with that, then you probably should be ignored, because there are things that you say that are good that the right will probably try and listen to. And again, that's why you see people that, like, you see your Russell Brands, you see RFK, you see Elon Musk, because you get to a point where it becomes about critical reasoning. And Elon Musk probably shouldn't have had to step in and do critical reasoning by proxy for our political establishment. But again, they're the establishment. They have no vested interest in seeing this change. It's a really strange situation, but it really is a movement of the people right now. That's so wild about it. Mm-hmm. And as you see, things are moving fast now too. People are really excited about all the stuff Trump has done just in the last 5 or 6 days. So this is a totally different situation than 2016. It's going to be wild.
Well, I did want to ask about the appointments, but before we get to that, I just did have one other question about the polling and prediction going into the race, because somebody who got a decent amount of press was Alan Lichtman, and he came out with a prediction that Kamala Harris was going to win the race. And he does this because he has these 13 keys that he basically looks at the state of the economy and the political landscape and foreign policy, and he puts them all together into these 13 keys. And if there's a certain threshold for false versus true based on, again, these different keys, then he predicts that there's going to be either a new party in office or the incumbent party. And he obviously predicted it wrong. It was really his first prediction that he ever got wrong. He did technically say that Gore was going to beat Bush, but you could kind of put an asterisk next to that based on what happened. So it was really his first big miss ever. And, significantly because Donald Trump handily won the election. And he's come back and sort of explained why this happened. He said that he wasn't accounting for racism and sexism. He did make one actually good point about, the fact that Joe Biden was demonized by his own party until he dropped out, and then they handed it to Kamala Harris without having any primaries. So, that's a pretty fair point. But he also talked about disinformation, said that Elon Musk is spreading disinformation like never before. But I have to say, these are all his sort of retrospective explanations. There were some people like Kim Iverson, for example, who prior to the election were looking at his keys and saying, I don't know how this guy is reading these this way, because he was saying the economy was good, both the short-term and the long-term economy. He said there was no foreign policy failure when, one could argue that Ukraine has been a failure. He said there was no social unrest, just like discounting everything, with the Gaza protests or with the COVID protests. So, personally, it seems to me as though he read his keys wrong, but I'd love to just hear what your thoughts are on Alan Lichtman and his prediction.
Yeah, this clown. But first off, I don't put out election predictions. I put out data. And I like that because people can look at my data and say, well, that's great, but I disagree with it because X, Y, Z. And fine, go compare me to another poll, which is more data. And then you can make an informed decision. He's making decisions for people. And that's great. Like, that's better than your, drunk uncle at Thanksgiving, just like making a call. Oh, this person's going to win. Well, why the decision process is being made. He's publishing it. And yet he's making election predictions. I don't know. It's like, if he's wrong, it's like, oh, he was wrong. Well, you just put all this stock into somebody who is wrong and you don't know why, right? And like Nate Silver, for instance, is wild. And the whole 538 thing. And like, ostensibly, it's a good idea. Take the polling data, correct it. Maybe you can add statistical significance and important, like, you could fix it. And yet he doesn't. They don't. They put out at the very end, based on 80,000 Monte Carlo the cycles, they got exactly 50-50. Well, that's crazy. So they have an equal chance of being right or wrong. And it's like completely, it's embarrassing to say that. It's like, that's what your models came up with. It's not true. Trump was polling better this cycle than ever before, and yet your statistical models said 50-50. So this Lichtman guy, I put no stock into, and the only reason I know he exists is because people were coming to my DMs and saying, I think Alan's wrong, and here's why. And so if most of your followers know you're wrong because they're interpreting your system better than you, then yeah, it's because your biases, it's the integrity piece. Like you've lost your integrity, your biases have taken over, it's clouding your judgment. And I can see how that happens to people in his situation. I'm pretty sure he's a professor. I don't know if he's still working or not, but we all know what college campuses are right now. I'm sure he's in this massive bubble. And so I was looking like you were at his apology, and I did not see what I was expecting. Well, I guess I kind of did, but his apology was, "Sorry, I missed it, but reasons." Like, no, sorry, I missed it. Like, my bias clouded my judgment. That's what I was expecting to see, a real apology. And he didn't give anybody a real apology. And so, yeah, maybe the 13 keys have merit, but I'm not going to trust him as long as that guy's doing them. And
Well, I
like
mean,
arrogant,
it's a weird thing, right?
yeah,
Because he has called all these elections correctly previously, right? So, like, you have to give him some credit for that. He would say in his defense, I called that Trump was going to win in 2016. I called that George W. Bush was going to win in 2004. I called that Ronald Reagan was going to win back in the 80s when he was polling low. So, that's all to his credit. But again, I do think this kind of goes into the whole demographic shift where we're seeing where there are these echo chambers, right? And people are just sort of, he's falling into this elitist bubble. The media that he's getting is wildly different than media that other people are getting, and he would call that disinformation. But we might argue what side the disinformation is actually happening on. So I think that kind
yeah.
of that goes into, we're seeing the stratification, because again, they're basically living in this elitist academic echo chamber.
Are we or are we not men made in the image of God with free will? Take responsibility for your own media consumption, dude. You know what I'm saying? Like at a certain point, like he knows he's being lied to. He absolutely knows he's being lied to. It's like elitism porn is what they're watching. It's like, dude, you got to quit. Like that's the problem, and they know it. And I'll tell you, Trump 2016, in my opinion, is an entirely different animal than Trump 2020. And that's, I think, one of the major differences is that I think people tapped into the elite machine understand that this is fundamentally different. The alien at the end of Starship Troopers, it's afraid. That's why it's different, because Trump is going to learn. They know Trump's going to learn from his mistakes. Trump's going to appoint the right people. Trump is going to be merciless with the people who betray him in the government. He's going to, I mean, the big food, the pharmaceutical industry, the military industrial complex. Think about the forces in absolute utter fear right now about what like RFK is going to come in and do to them, about what Trump's going to do to their proxy wars. Like that's why it's different than 2016. It was a novelty back then. You remember the Pied Piper thing. In fact, Hillary Clinton was puffing Trump up before he became the nominee. So totally different.
Um, well, just going back to Lichtman, the one thing that I found very interesting in his apology video, and it wasn't even really part of his explanation, it just sort of came
No,
afterwards.
I'm glad you watched it. I watched the first 30 seconds. Nope, he's not apologizing, so I tuned out. Yeah.
Well, him and his son are talking about the results, and what they keep coming back to is this huge drop off that the Democrats saw. They were saying 13 million because California has taken a while. It's probably going to end up being less than 10 million, but still, it's an historic drop off. It's 10, 15%. It's a really big drop off from 2020 to 2024. And this is what I guess a lot of people are kind of struggling to understand is why did so many Democrats come home? Obviously, or stay home. And I think that there's been a lot of folks sort of thinking, looking at the trend of the elections over the last several years, looking at 2012, looking at 2016, looking at this huge spike in 2020, and then seeing it come back down in 2024. It seems a little suspicious. I guess I'm just wondering what your general thoughts are on, you know, how did this
Yeah.
happen where they were able to get such a huge turnout in 2020, but they weren't able to this time?
Yeah, it's becoming increasingly more difficult to predict what the electorate's going to look like, because what people say in polls about how much enthusiasm and how likely they are to vote is totally broken from who actually turns out. So that's a problem. And in retrospect, I'm surprised we were as accurate as we were back in 2020, because that was an absolute mind blower. And we got raked over the coals for 2018 for totally missing that one. But it was like a 3 sigma increase in turnout for Democrats that cycle. And so we are one of the only pollsters that publicly acknowledge that election fraud is something important that needs to be tracked, because how can we be accurate? How can we do our jobs correctly if the electorate in reality totally doesn't match the polling? And that's what we're wrestling. That's what everybody is wrestling with. They just won't say it. And so we've polled more than anybody else on this topic. We've probably asked 100 questions now of the public, tens of thousands of responses about election integrity. And ultimately what it comes down to is Americans have no confidence in our elections, and they want massive accountability. They want an increase in security with things like paper ballots, no machines, bipartisan audits, stuff that basically they don't get. IDs, everybody wants an ID. Why wouldn't you want that? And it's in a long line of things that voters want and they do not get out of Congress because the entrenched status quo has no incentive to give them accountability. And that's what's crazy. And I will tell you, looking at even this election, a lot of magical ballots appeared in the last one, right, in 2020. And we were interested and looked into it. And one of the things that we found, just one of them, is that we asked people who voted in 2020, at your address, did you receive more than one mail-in ballot addressed to you or somebody in your household? 20% of all voters said yes. So there were literally at least 20% more mail-in ballots sent out than there were voters. So that's some of it. The question is how much? And then the other thing looking at this election is that the national popular vote was Biden 4.5 ostensibly back in 2020. It's going to be about 2 points now. So that's a 6.5 point shift to the right. But the battlegrounds only shifted 2 or 3 points to the right.
Really?
Yeah. It's
Well, I can say that's true too, because I was looking at the results here in Connecticut, and even though it went to Harris, almost every single town in Connecticut went more Republican than they did in the last election.
Yeah. New York and New Jersey went 11 points to the right. Pennsylvania went 3. So that is what I've been saying every Republican voter should ask every day for the next 4 years. And it's a mix of things. It's not just fraud. It's, okay, massive asymmetry in the spending. Okay. And we all saw that James O'Keefe video that he did with the Act Blue stuff, right? Won't get into specifics. But that's something right there that a really massive RICO case could clean up pretty quick. Okay. So there's that. There's the miraculous ability of the urban Democrat heavy population centers to turn out what Democrats need when they need them. Massive ballot harvesting things that need to happen, and the fraud investigations. And then also probably a restructuring in some way of the Republican Party across the country. I know there are some really good local Republican people, and yet I've heard horror stories about what happens when a MAGA candidate tries to run. And that really needs to be looked at. Quite frankly, probably the biggest loser on Tuesday last week was establishment Republicans. You can almost taste how bright the light at the end of the tunnel was for them. I mean, seriously, they came one day away from not having to worry about Donald Trump anymore. And now there's a new sheriff in town. And so I think just this morning, I wonder if any information's come out about the vote. You have establishment Republicans battling to maintain the hold they have on the direction of the party, because the Senate leadership fund really can pick winners and losers. Just as, I mean, you look at Arizona, Carrie Lake lost, but she got zero money from Mitch McConnell, zero. He was throwing millions at places like the Maryland race. So that's going to change. That all should be good, because quite frankly, the Trump platform is the closest to what voters want right now. That's it. And they're not getting it because the establishment.
Well, one last thing I wanted to talk about was third parties, because, I think that there was a decent amount of focus on third parties, at least, on social media networks like X. You had Jill Stein, you had Chase Oliver. RFK ran as a third party candidate for about a year before he ended up endorsing Trump. And just looking at the results, I found them pretty interesting, because third parties did historically bad, especially the Libertarian Party. This was actually the first year since 2000 that Greens came in third place, and we just saw a huge drop off in Libertarian support for their presidential candidate. But if you look at Texas, for example, the Libertarian Senate candidate in Texas got hundreds of thousands more votes than their presidential nominee. We also saw something interesting in Arizona too, where the Green Party Senate candidate there got, I think, about 60,000 more votes than Jill Stein did. So it seems as though, I think part of this could be explained by, Trump really courted he really courted libertarians. He went to the Libertarian convention. He was very bullish on Bitcoin. Bitcoin actually has spiked the last few days. It went up about 25 grand. It went from about 60 or I think in the 60s up to about 85,000 now. So I think part of that could be explained by Trump reaching out to libertarians, but I wonder too if Greens really ended up voting for Trump over over their own nominee.
Yeah, the ins and outs of it really begs a very close look at the actual turnout results, because all of this stuff basically disappears in the margin of error of the polling. We did see a lot with the third party. We saw just a year ago, RFK was getting 15, 16% of the national vote. And we saw time after time that number ticked down. And I think one of the reasons is because people wanted change. That's why they entertained him. But over time, it became very clear that it wasn't a viable path forward to change. Didn't have a chance of winning. Trump looked like he was, getting his game on. Kamala Harris probably peeled off a lot of those supporters. Biden. It was almost like a political Armageddon, though, where everybody picked a side. That's why I think that the third parties did so poorly, although some of it's self-inflicted. I'm pretty sure that libertarians wouldn't tell you that Chase Oliver was the best candidate. And quite frankly, I think when people are hurting, that's when the luxury beliefs go away, which I think listen, there's a lot to love about the libertarian platform. It's not very pragmatic. It doesn't really have a lot of answers for what happens when DC is occupied territory, entrenched grift, and when the corporate machine is plugged right on into the political machine. Like, what's their answer to that? Oh, more freedom? That's a tough one. And so really hard to answer. I know there were ups and downs in a lot of states, but the national polling showed these people never had a chance, less than 1%. And that's different because, third parties can really spoil elections. And I think there's a bad side and a good side. Like the idea that the two-party system exists and isn't in the past giving voters what they want is probably fine, probably a bad thing. But you look what happened with the libertarians. I suspect that Elon Musk joining forces with Donald Trump was probably a big thing there as well. And the idea of like, now we kind of finally have some unity, RFK joining the Republican ticket. So maybe what'll happen is the Republicans will build a new Republican Party that actually speaks for voters. And then the whole idea of third parties will be kind of unnecessary.
Well, I have to say, just if you look at the lineup for the Trump Madison Square Garden event, it really spoke to the broad coalition that he had built, from Elon Musk to Tulsi Gabbard to RFK to Tucker Carlson, and even having people like Dr. Phil and Hulk Hogan. He really built this very large coalition of people to sort of, grab voters from across the political spectrum, or even people who may not have voted previously. So yeah, I think that had to kind of eat up the oxygen from potential third party candidates too.
Yeah, a lot more of a broad coalition for sure than the Democrat coalition, which seems to entirely be made up of credentialed elite or wealthy people. That's what their coalition was. Like, tell me somebody that wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, they did have a lot of celebrities towards the end there, but yeah, I think there was even one instance where I guess Beyonce was at one event, and then people thought she was putting on a concert, and when she didn't end up doing that and just introduced Kamala, then a lot of people started leaving the event. So
yeah, she got paid like 500,000 per word for that appearance.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, something like that. I think it was she got a 5 million check, I think.
Wow.
That's what all these people are paid. Eminem was paid like 1.8 million. They were all paid.
Wow. Well, I did have one patron question for you. Actually, speaking of being paid, I do let my patrons submit questions at patreon.com/Primo Radical for only $1 a month. Did have one question for you, and again, this is it's not me asking. This is my patron. He writes, how do you make the polls more representative of the working people who never get surveyed because they don't have a landline, aren't available the hours they survey, or just don't give an F about the candidates you're asking about? Will Rasmussen or any other polling companies ever properly frame questions to not be biased against non-voters and independents?
Not be biased. Quora is telling me Beyonce got paid 10 million.
Wow.
To not be, frame the question to not be biased. All right, here's some facts. Polling will always exist, and if it doesn't, then you're Venezuela. So there's that. Polling is also getting a lot harder. And that's because people were a lot more innocent, innocent times. They all had landlines and they'd pick the phone up and they'd want to engage in the political discourse and they would answer polls. But over time, that's less and less true. I will say half of our polling is still landline robodials, which has been proven cycle after cycle to be more accurate than anything all the other people with bigger budgets are doing. And so half of that still goes out to there's 90 million landlines in the US. In the last 4 years, 500,000 people in America have picked up the phone call and answered about our polls. Now you can say, all right, well, you're not reaching young people. Maybe you're not reaching more urban or more minority folks. And like, yeah, that's why we use online panel aggregators now. So we can specifically target those people. And a lot of pollsters have moved 100% into that. But the fundamental problem with that is, you're at the complete risk of the panel not representing America. So we've been very careful about testing the data, making sure that it matches election results and being careful about who we use. And then the other is that the fundamental human, the type of human that sits at home and answers a poll for money is different than somebody that's picking up the phone and giving you a piece of their mind for the civic duty. The latter is much more likely to show up and vote. And so the problem is that everybody's wrestling with is that these people on the online panels don't really know a lot about them. They say they're going to vote, but maybe they don't. They really don't know who party is. So it makes the results a lot more hard to interpret, and they're rushing through the poll as fast as possible. And if you get the results you want, maybe you don't mess around with that. But if you're careful about laying traps for them, getting rid of people that take the polls too fast, you can still get usable data out of that. Ultimately, what it comes down to is any data stream, no matter how garbage, can be reasonably calibrated to be accurate as long as you're being systematic about it. You know, and that's why we keep the whole system up and running the entire time. And we don't just disappear and come back and try and make sense of whatever crap that we downloaded off the internet. And then also, there is going to be a future where people are going to pull a lot more heavily with cell phones and SMS to online results. And we've tested that and it works and it's better than the online panels, but it's just too expensive to bother with right now, especially when we're putting out polling every day. Now, as for question framing, I will say some of the questions we frame aren't great and some of them are awesome. And we have integrity and we're not push pollers. And so we're not trying to ask leading questions, but sometimes it's important to ask a leading question because it shows usable information. And so the answer to that is just we show people what questions we ask and what order we ask. We don't leave anything out. So we're not going to say like Donald Trump kicks kittens. Will you vote for Donald Trump? Yes or no? And then you hide the whole part about Trump kicking kittens. I mean, people do that. They absolutely 100% do that in the industry. It's a lack of integrity and they're wrong. And they have a vested interest, like we said, in some cases of being wrong, and they'll continue to do it. And ultimately what it comes down to, again, is we're independent. We don't have these incentives. We have no dog in this hunt. We just want to be accurate. And if we're not, our business ceases to exist.
Well, you did mention Trump's cabinet picks, and I did just want to, I guess, briefly ask you about that and just your sort of subjective interpretation. My reading on it is I think there was a lot of exuberance when he announced that Nikki Haley and Mike Pompeo were not going to be in the administration. Personally speaking, I've seen, since then, not a lot of exuberance over most of his picks. Especially I don't think it's officially been announced yet, but they're saying that Marco Rubio may be the Secretary of State. I think a lot of people are kind of pushing back on that. So just curious what your sort of thoughts are on his cabinet pick so far and, how his voters may react to that?
I'm seeing so much, and I love the dialogue. First, I would say that Republican voters really do not like Republican politicians. Mitch McConnell barely polls better than Nancy Pelosi does among Republicans. So the idea that the establishment is picking and choosing. Listen, we tested Nikki Haley against Joe Biden. She didn't even get 55% of Republican voters against Joe Biden. It was that bad.
Wow.
And so, yeah, they do not want her anywhere near this. And I think that Mike Pompeo's got better favorability than her. We haven't tested it in a long time. But what you're seeing on the internet is kind of the core and the thought leadership. Like, this is a movement of the people. The people talking on Twitter about Trump's cabinet picks are people that are really tapped into the conservative movement. That's new and crazy. That the fact that the main public town square is what is driving conservative conversations right now. That's as a public opinion professional, I'm telling you, that's wild and unlike anything we've seen before. Now, there is a lot of like negative talk about some of the stuff. And listen, like, you just voted for a leader. Sit back and let him lead, please. Because you just got Homan, which is the number one. It's exactly what voters told us they wanted, is somebody who's just going to come in here and just brutally execute an anti-illegal immigration campaign. And you
sorry to interrupt you. I was kind of curious though, for this border czar, do you know like what kind of official authority they have?
I have no idea. But Trump said he's going to shut the border. He picked a guy who the border patrol themselves say they want Trump because they want to shut the border. And I think that Trump is going to make good on his word. That's ultimately what this comes down to, right? Is that this is a new Trump. He has shown throughout the campaign that he's been making decisions way better than he has before. And he's dealing with DC. He's not going to be able to pick every single one you like. Now, some of these people are out there, I think, just trying to engagement farm and get some more ad revenue share on Twitter. So you're going to see a lot of this kind of like questioning. And listen, there is a scenario where Rubio comes in, and I know people change, right? JD Vance, everybody says, oh, that was a great pick. He was trashing Trump like just a few years ago. Now, there's probably more reasons to be suspicious of Rubio, but there's also scenarios in where a strong leader can pick somebody who's not perfect for the job and get a good outcome. And I think that Trump has probably earned people's trust to come in and lead and make these kind of decisions. It's not like every single person, it's not like the people that picked Homan just made a mistake with Rubio. That's what I'm saying, right? And so people just need to chill out, enjoy what they're seeing. I think the great news is how rapidly these things are coming out and how much positive discussion there is about it. But you see the butthurt DeSantis people probably going to be some of the people driving this kind of discussion, and people ultimately need to say chill out. I think that's what they all should be saying on Twitter right now.
Well, I wonder too if some folks are having kind of flashbacks to some of the choices that were made in the first administration, right? Because you had people like John Bolton, like there were probably kind of bad choices that were made back then, right?
Well, there are a million of them, and people should have PTSD. PTSD from 2016 is everything Trump went through transitioning. PTSD from 2020 is what we all know, right? And that hung over. I mean, like, it was a close thing on Tuesday. It really looked like it was within the margin of, and I think we probably will find out in years in the future that there was a really big bullet that got dodged on Tuesday night. But yeah, like Elon, RFK, Tulsi Gabbard, Susie Wallace did a good job on the campaign. He's got Miller in there. These people are not going to make the same bad choices. And listen, no matter how much you might not like him, Rubio is not Bolton. He's just absolutely is not.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have to say about the campaign, I do think that they did just a spectacular job, especially like the McDonald's thing, the driving around in a garbage truck, the way that narrative changed so quickly from the joke that was made at Madison Square Garden, liberals freaking out about it, to Joe Biden calling Trump supporters garbage, to then Trump driving around in a garbage truck. The fact that they were able to pivot that so quickly really was some great campaigning. And again, the McDonald's thing, that was iconic. So I just think, some credit has to be given to the campaign for just running a very unorthodox historic campaign.
Yeah, and efficient too. Just the meta ad spend alone, Trump, depending on the battleground state, was outspent 5 to 10x. So there's just a complete asymmetry in the way that this campaign was run. And it did seem touch and go. Like, I don't know behind the scenes how much control they had, but they did exactly what they needed to get the power they needed to come in and execute on his agenda. So give him a chance, guys. Chill. Like, enjoy the show.
Well, Mark, I really appreciate you being on the show today. I am kind of curious too. What are you folks going to be sort of working on and following for the next couple of years?
I think we're in for a lot of crazy stuff. I do think the entrenched powers that be have no incentive to willingly turn over the keys to a massive machine that they've had control over for decades. That might be a little too truthy for a public opinion pollster to say, oh, you're biased. Well, yeah, but we nailed the election. Our polls are not biased. And so we poll every day. We put out public opinion journalism. We think it's really important. How else would anybody know that Donald Trump's massive deportation promise was what the people wanted? Because the mainstream media is certainly not going to report on that. And so we see ourselves as the antidote to gaslighting. And that's what we're going to poll on. All of these new things that are happening, all of the new psychological operations that the Democrats are going to throw at the Republicans. It's going to get wild. So people should come follow us, Rasmussen_poll on Twitter, or go to our website, RasmussenReports.com. You can get a free daily newsletter where you at least see what kind of stuff we're talking about. And reader subscriptions are really cheap. Love to have everybody there.
Well, I think you should maybe throw in a poll question out there just to see how many people think Starlink hacked the vote, because again, that's something I'm seeing a lot of on X. So
we're going to absolutely 100%. The very first, we've done so little post-election polling yet, and right now it's like, oh, whose fault was it? That kind of thing. People are blaming Harris more than Biden, which is pretty interesting. And yet, yeah, election integrity, we're not dropping that topic. The very first question is, how likely was it that the outcome of this election was affected by cheating? I expect to see an uptick because there will be an uptick in Democrats, and then we're going to get into why for sure.
Awesome. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to that. And again, I really appreciate you being on the show today, and hopefully I can have you back on again sometime soon.
Yeah, I'd love to, anytime.